Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
In the mythological novel, Investiture of the Gods, who is the real protagonist? The answer seems obvious: figures like Jiangxia, Neja, Yangjian, and Wenzhong. These powerful deities and warriors dominate the story, orchestrating battles in a grand celestial war. The novel's core is the fall of the Shang Dynasty and the rise of the Zhou Dynasty. On the surface, a human conflict, but in reality, a struggle between the Taoist sects of Chan and Jie. In this male-dominated tale, female characters usually fade into the background, but one woman stands apart. Not only does she play a major role, but she also directly influences the downfall of King Zhou and the Shang Dynasty. Even in later operas and folklore, her image is more memorable than any male character. Her name is Su Daji, a woman later vilified as a calamity beauty. However, if we look closely at the original Investiture of the Gods, things aren't that simple. Su Daji wasn't just a seductive consort, she was a puppet possessed by the nine-tailed fox spirit. Her corrupting influence on King Zhou was actually part of a grander scheme, an order from the Jai sect, a crucial step in the divine plan. So, was Daji really just a femme fatale? Was she truly evil, or simply powerless to resist her fate? Today, let's explore two of the most infamous stories about Su Daji and her time at King Zhou's side. The city of Zhaoge was drowned in decadence. Inside the grand palace, golden lanterns cast a warm glow, while the music of flutes and lutes filled the air. Exotic delicacies covered jade plates, and courtesans in sheer silks danced gracefully. King Zhou lounged on his dragon-carved jade throne, his gaze unfocused, his face steeped in indulgence. One hand swirled a goblet of fragrant wine, the other rested lightly on Su Daji's waist. Daji, dressed in a crimson silk robe, leaned against him. She knew King Zhou was completely lost in pleasure. Lowering her head, she whispered seductively in his ear, "Your Majesty, I recently heard something intriguing." King Zhou lazily lifted his eyelids. "What is it?" Daji smiled mysteriously. "I heard that our Grand Chancellor Bi Gan was born with a 7 orifices exquisite heart. They say this heart is uniquely clear and pure, capable of seeing through all things, distinguishing right from wrong. Your Majesty, I am foolish and slow. So I wonder, does such a heart really exist? If we do not see it with our own eyes, how can we be sure it is real?" King Zhou's eyes narrowed slightly. 7 orifices, exquisite heart? Daji nodded, feigning innocence. "Yes, if your Majesty seeks wise governance, should we not confirm if Bi Gan is truly as brilliant as people claim? If he is indeed a rare genius, then keeping him close would be wise. But if it is merely an empty rumor, why allow such a man to create unrest in court?" Silence hung in the air. King Zhou tapped his fingers against the jade table, his thoughts swirling. Bi Gan. That old man. He had always been too loyal, too righteous, and frankly, too much of a nuisance. Every time he stood in court, he would cast those condemning eyes at the king, urging him to abandon Daji, to stop his extravagant indulgences, to rule wisely, even to banish her from the palace. And now he possesses some so-called 7 orifices exquisite heart. A shadow crossed King Zhou's face. Behind him, Daji's voice was soft, sweet as honey, yet laced with poison. "Your Majesty, don't you wish to see it for yourself?" A chilling gleam flickered in King Zhou's eyes. "Summon Bi Gan to the palace, immediately." The next morning, Grand Chancellor Bi Gan hurried to the palace, his official robes billowing behind him. His expression was solemn, and a sense of foreboding tightened in his chest. King Zhou had fallen too far. his mind drowned in wine, his heart ensnared by that woman. Since Su Daji's arrival, the king had grown increasingly ruthless, building lavish pleasure palaces, drowning himself in excess. Ministers had begged him to change, but their words were worthless. Only Bigan still dared to speak truth to power. Why has the king summoned me today? Could it be another one of Daji's tricks? Bigan clenched his hands into fists as he stepped into the grand hall. Inside, King Zhou sat on his throne, Daji standing at his side, smiling as if she had been waiting just for him. Bigan strode forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, your humble servant greets you." King Zhou regarded him indifferently, his tone casual. "Grand Chancellor, I have heard something peculiar. Do you truly possess a seven orifices exquisite heart?" Bigan's brows furrowed. He sensed danger. "Your Majesty, such talk is mere folklore, nothing more than a baseless rumor." Daji chuckled, covering her lips with her delicate fingers. "Oh, Grand Chancellor, if it's just a rumor, then surely you have nothing to fear. But the entire kingdom believes in this heart of yours. If His Majesty does not verify the truth, wouldn't that leave him blind to the wisdom of his court?" Bigan's eyes flashed with realization. He turned to Daji, his voice like iron. "Daji, a ruler who walks the righteous path shall find loyal ministers by his side. A ruler who strays invites disaster. You have bewitched the king, thrown the court into chaos. You are the true curse of this nation." Daji's smile did not waver, only growing more playful. "My dear Grand Chancellor, do not be so angry. I am merely curious, and so is our beloved king." She tilted her head, gazing at King Zhou. King Zhou's eyes darkened. "Bigan, you claim to be a loyal minister. Then let us see if your heart is truly as extraordinary as they say." His voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "Cut it out. Let me see it with my own eyes." A sharp intake of breath. Bigan's face turned pale. "Your Majesty, loyalty and treachery cannot be measured by a heart's shape. Have you truly fallen so low?" But King Zhou was already waving his hand. "Seize him. Cut out his heart." Guards surged forward, grabbing Bigan by the arms. He struggled, his voice thundering through the hall. "Your Majesty, my heart has always belonged to this kingdom, but now it is in the hands of demons." Daji laughed softly. Her eyes were filled not with cruelty, but something even worse, amusement. The sound of steel cutting through flesh echoed through the hall. Moments later, the seven orifices exquisite heart lay in King Zhou's trembling hands, still warm, still beating. Bigan staggered, blood pouring from his chest. He looked up, his breath shallow, but his voice unwavering. "The Shang Dynasty is doomed." With those final words, he collapsed, lifeless. Daji clapped her hands together, smiling in delight. So it was real after all. King Zhou stared at the heart in his hands, doubt flickering in his eyes, but only for a moment. That night, a loyal minister died, and a kingdom inched closer to ruin. It was a dark, oppressive night, and the dungeons of Zhaoge held a prisoner of noble blood, Shibo Ho Ji Chang, the lord of the western region. Once, he was the revered ruler of Jiki, loved by his people and respected across the land. But now, he sat chained in a damp, suffocating cell, his feet bound by heavy iron shackles, deprived of the sun for months. What was his crime? He had spoken out against the court. But Ji Chang knew the truth. This wasn't about politics. He was here because King Zhou had listened to Su Daji's whispers, convinced that Ji Chang harbored treasonous intent. For a year, he languished in darkness, surviving on meager scraps of food. His once strong frame had withered, his hair had turned white, but his spirit remained unbroken. He waited for a chance to escape. And then, one day, his salvation arrived. But what awaited him was worse than death itself. A decree was issued. King Zhou invited Ji Chang to a feast. Guards dragged him from his cell, bathed him, dressed him in fine robes, and led him to the grand hall of the palace. As he stood before the towering crimson doors, a dreadful unease gripped his heart. Inside, golden lanterns shimmered, and music swirled through the air. The tables were laden with exquisite dishes, filling the hall with tantalizing aromas. At the head of the banquet, King Zhou lounged in his seat, a pleased smile on his lips. Beside him, Su Daji descended the jade steps, gracefully carrying a steaming bowl of soup. Ji Chang stood motionless, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Daji stepped closer, cradling the bowl in her delicate hands, her voice laced with honeyed sweetness. "Lord Ji Chang," she purred, "His Majesty is kind and merciful. Knowing that you have suffered in the dungeons for so long, he has specially prepared this feast for you. He hopes you will recover quickly." Ji Chang looked down at the soup. The rich fragrance of meat rose from the surface, thick and overwhelming. Hunger gnawed at his insides, his body long deprived of proper nourishment. Yet something felt wrong. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet Daji's eyes. Her expression was too amused. His heart pounded. Daji tilted her head, a playful smile curling her lips. She gently pushed the bowl closer. "Why hesitate, Lord Ji Chang? This is His Majesty's gift to you." Ji Chang glanced at King Zhou. The king watched him with casual amusement, as though he were a spectator at a grand performance. The entire hall fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. Taking a deep breath, Ji Chang reached for the bowl, lifting the spoon. He scooped up a piece of tender, glistening meat and placed it into his mouth. He chewed, swallowed. Daji's smile deepened. "So, how does it taste?" she asked softly. Ji Chang paused, then spoke in an even tone. "The meat is rich and flavorful. An excellent dish." Daji chuckled. She leaned closer, her lips almost brushing his ear. And in a voice as light as a whisper, she spoke two chilling words. "Your son." Time seemed to freeze. Ji Chang's entire body went stiff. The meat in his mouth turned to ash on his tongue. His breath caught. His throat closed. His stomach wrenched violently as a wave of nausea threatened to consume him. Daji's eyes glowed with cruel delight. She raised her hand, and a golden platter was carried forward. On it lay a single bone, half gnawed, its surface still stained with crimson. "The remains," she murmured, "of your son, Bo Yikao." Ji Chang's blood turned to ice. Bo Yikao, his firstborn, his heir, the beloved son who had traveled to Zhaoge, begging for his father's release. He had come with hope, and now his flesh was served as a banquet dish. Daji traced a finger along the bone, then picked it up gently and placed it in Ji Chang's trembling hands. "His Majesty was deeply offended when your son pleaded for your freedom," she said sweetly. "So, to punish his audacity, we granted him death." She leaned in, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But I thought, since father and son share such a deep bond, wouldn't it be lovely for you two to be reunited? In a different way?" Her smile widened. "So how does it feel to have your own flesh and blood inside you?" Ji Chang's vision blurred. A piercing pain twisted through his chest, grief so overwhelming it threatened to crush him. He looked down at the bone in his hand, then up at Daji, then at King Zhou, who still wore that disgustingly satisfied smirk. A deep guttural laughter bubbled up from his throat. The hall echoed with it, a bitter, grief-stricken sound filled with rage, sorrow, and unyielding defiance. He raised his voice, booming like thunder. "King Zhou, you have lost all humanity. The heavens will not forgive this." King Zhou, drunk on power and wine, merely laughed. Daji, watching with satisfaction, gently patted Ji Chang's trembling hand. "Take this bone with you," she whispered. "Consider it a keepsake." Her eyes gleamed. "After all, it's your bloodline." Ji Chang gripped the bone tightly. His fingers dug into it until his knuckles turned white. His entire body shook with fury, but he did not break. He could not die here. Not yet. He had to live. He had to return to Shiki. He had to see the Shang Dynasty fall, for his son, for vengeance, and for justice. The human flesh banquet remains one of the most horrifying moments in Investiture of the Gods. It wasn't just murder, it was psychological destruction. Daji didn't simply kill Ji Chang's son. She forced him to consume his own child's flesh, stripping him of dignity, corrupting his very soul. She needed no weapons. Her cruelty alone was sharper than any blade, because she understood the deepest pain isn't death, it's living with the unbearable. But in doing so, she planted the seeds of her own destruction. Ji Chang did not die. He returned to Shiki, and in the years that followed, his grief and rage fueled a rebellion, one that would topple the Shang Dynasty and erase Su Daji's reign of terror forever. In the end, it wasn't divine punishment or celestial justice that ended her. It was the hatred of a broken father. And so with one cruel feast, the fate of a dynasty was sealed.